Now, if you study the Nigerian woman, Madam Tenabu, who was in the trade for local consumption, when she discovered that the people that she was capturing and using for local consumption were being taken out of Africa, not returned, she began a war on the trade and fought the trade to a standstill and fought all the kings in the business, including the king of then Abukuru. And this is well recorded. And part of the story that there was a man asking for her hand because her husband had killed, asking for her hand in marriage. And she told him that she had a man's work to do and she was not a woman until she finished it. And her job she considered to be is to pull from the throne every king in the slave trade. And when the last one was no longer king, she turned to the man that had been asking for her hand in marriage and said, okay, I will marry you now. I'm a woman. Now I'm a woman. I finished the man's work, so now I'm a woman. Married and went to a place called Jos in Nigeria.
The west coast of Africa, looking today much as it did 100 years ago. At that time, the old evils of the slave trade had become a distant, though disgraceful, memory. But there now opened a new chapter of confrontation along these tropical shores. In past years, Europeans had come here for profitable business. Now they wanted more, much more. Old trading posts like this one had long been the scene of a partnership between maritime traders from Europe and local Africans. By the 1880s, that old partnership was being swept away in a dramatic change, the outcome of a new European drive for overseas empire. Industrialized countries led by France and Britain had begun to invade the black continent, each hoping for new sources of raw materials for its factories, new markets for its manufactures, and new positions of advantage against its rivals. This was called the Scramble for Africa. By 1914, only two countries remained outside European possession, Liberia in the west and Ethiopia in the east. Britain had seized the lion's share of control. Egypt and the Sudan in the north, the immense wealth of South Africa, valuable colonies like Rhodesia and Kenya, and richly populated territories such as Nigeria and the Gold Coast. France had invaded Algeria in the 1830s. Now, after new wars of conquest, she added more colonies to her empire south of the Sahara, including the island of Madagascar. Little Portugal carved out two vast colonies, Angola and Mozambique, while Imperial Germany took the Cameroons and southwest Africa, and on the east coast, Tanganyika. The vast Congo basin fell to King Leopold of the Belgians. Italy and Spain completed the enclosure. The fate of the continent was utterly changed. Between the colonizing powers themselves, the carve-up was peaceful, but their rivalry was intense. In 1884, a Congress of the competing governments met in Berlin to settle their disputes. Germany's Iron Chancellor Bismarck was there. And active behind the scenes was the ambitious Belgian king. He spoke for them all when he said, "I am determined to get my share of this magnificent African cake." Any power that could occupy African soil could effectively claim it. Now the task was to stake out frontiers in utterly uncharted land. Said the French Prime Minister, "We have embarked on a gigantic steeplechase into the unknown." The British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury was to say of this period, "We've been engaged in drawing lines on maps where no man's foot has ever trod. We've been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where we were. The great game was to get hold of places and positions of advantage over rivals, no matter what irrational frontiers might result. One of the most absurd cases was the magnificent Gambia River. Britain had long held Bathurst, Banjul today, and was determined to keep this river route to the interior. But France, invading from the west coast, enclosed all the territory surrounding the Gambia River in her new colony of Senegal. So the French were naturally eager to obtain the Gambia River. They offered Britain, in exchange, the much larger and richer Ivory Coast. But the British Parliament insisted on keeping the Gambia, thus dividing the peoples of the region. And the result was, and is, a country that is 300 miles long, but never more than 30 miles wide. What the African inhabitants might think of this colonial carve-up was never asked. The European idea, in the words of one British governor, was to seize African territory and then, as much as possible, rule the country as if there were no inhabitants. In fact, European contempt for Africans now reached new depths, and no wonder. For how otherwise than by asserting that Africans were helpless children, lazy savages, could Christian Europe justify taking their countries away from them? The helpless children, meanwhile, sang their own version of a famous hymn. Onward, Christian soldiers, into heathen lands, prayer books in your pockets, rifles in your hands. Take the happy tidings where trade can be done. Spread the peaceful gospel with the Gatling gun. The European invasions were widely resisted. Conquest was never easy. And sometimes, as these old drawings and photographs testify, conquest led to a ruthless killing that later generations would prefer to forget.
In the Congo, airplanes were dropping bombs on African villages. African villages don't have a defense against bombs, and the pilot can't tell who the bomb is being dropped upon. When a bomb hits a village, everything goes. And these pilots, filled with flying planes filled with bombs, dropping these bombs on African villages, were destroying women, were destroying children, were destroying babies. You never heard any outcry over here about that. And it had started way back in June. They would drop bombs on African villages that would blow that village apart and everything in it. Man, woman, child, and baby. No outcry, no sympathy, no support, no concern, because the press didn't project it in such a way that it would be designed to get your sympathy. They know how to put something so that you'll sympathize with it, and they know how to put it so you'll be against it. I'm telling you, they are masters at it. And if you don't develop the analytical ability to read between the lines in what they're saying, I'm telling you again, you're in a society that's just as capable of building gas ovens for black people as Hitler's society was. This was mass murder in the Congo of women and children and babies. But there was no outcry even from the white liberals, even from your friends. Why? Because they made it appear that it was a humanitarian project. They said that the planes were being flown by American-trained anti-Castro Cuban pilots. This is propaganda too. As soon as you hear that it's American-trained, you say, oh, that's all right, that's us. And the anti-Castro Cubans, oh, that's all right too, because if they're against Castro, whoever else they're against, that's good, because Castro's a monster. But you see how step by step they grab your mind? And these pilots are hired. Their salaries are paid by the United States government. They're called mercenaries, these pilots are. And a mercenary is not someone who kills you because he's patriotic. He kills you for blood money. He's a hired killer. That's what a mercenary means. And they're able to take these hired killers, put them in American planes with American bombs, and drop them on African villages, blowing to bits, black men, black women, black children, black babies, and you black people sitting over here cool, like it doesn't even involve you. You're a fool. They'll do it to them today and do it to you tomorrow. Because you and I and they are all the same. They call it a humanitarian project, and that they're doing it in the name of freedom. And all of this, these glorious terms are used to pave the way in your mind for what they're going to do. Then they take Chomby. You heard of Chomby. He's the worst African that was ever born. The lowest type that was ever born. He's a murderer himself. He's the murderer of Lumumba, the former prime minister of the Congo. He's an international, he's a murderer with an international stature as a murderer. Yet the United States government went and got Chomby in Spain and put him as the head of the Congolese government. Imagine this. This is criminal. Here's a man who's a murderer. So the United States takes him, puts him over the Congo, and supports his government with your tax dollars. Now, in other words, they hire him to occupy the position as head of state over the Congo. A killer. He is a hired killer himself. His salary paid by the United States government. And he turns, his first move is to bring in South Africans who hate everything in sight. He hires those South Africans to come and kill his own Congolese people. And the United States again pays their salary. You know, it's something to think about. How do you think you would feel right now if some Congolese brothers walked up to you? They look just like you. Don't think you don't look Congolese. You look as much Congolese as the Congolese does. Your tongue stays in your mouth. And you have to then go to the extreme to convince them that you don't go along with what the United States government is doing in the Congo. And they justified the usage of Chomby as the present head of state by saying he's the only African who can unite or bring unity to the Congo. Has he brought unity to the Congo? But see, this is their game. And their real reason for wanting Chomby there was so that Chomby could invite them to come in. No other African head of state would have dared to invite outside powers, so they put Chomby there. And as soon as Chomby got there, then he invited them to bring paratroopers from Belgium in the United States transport planes to try and recapture the Congo. This was all a cold-blooded act on the part of your Western powers, namely the Western powers here in the United States, the interest in the United States, in England, in France, and in Belgium, and so forth. They want the wealth of the Congo, plus its strategic geographic position. The step-by-step process that was used by the press, first they fan the flame in such a manner to create hysteria in the mind of the public, and then they shift gears and fan the flame in a manner designed to get the sympathy of the public. And once they go from hysteria to sympathy, their next step is to get the public to support them in whatever act they're getting ready to go down with. You're dealing with a cold, calculating, international machine that's so criminal in its objectives and motives that it has the seeds of its own destruction right within it. They use the press to emphasize that white hostages are being held by cannibals. Imagine that. Or white priests, white missionaries, white nuns. They don't say nuns. White nuns. You know what the paper said right here in Detroit. White missionaries. Not just a missionary. A white nun. As if there's a difference between a white nun and a black nun. Or a white priest and a black priest. Or if the life that's in a white skin is more valuable than a life within a black skin. This is what they're implying. And the press, go get the press when this thing was going on, and you see what I'm talking about. They're vicious in their whiteness. The next thing that is good to know about Chomby, no Congolese troops have ever won any victories whatsoever for the present Congolese government. Congolese soldiers won't even fight unless they're forced to. But the fighters in the Congo were the freedom fighters, these brothers from the Oriental Eastern province. And they fought with stones and sticks and rocks, spears and arrows. And the only time they had a gun was when they got some soldier who had it, and they'd kill him and take his gun. But they were winning. They took over 2/3 of the Congo, showing you they were fighting from their heart. Whereas these other people, their heart wasn't in it. And because of the fighting spirit of these people, it will be impossible for Chombe to remain as head of state over the Congo without additional troops, white troops, constantly being brought in from South Africa or elsewhere. But sooner or later, these troops are going to give out, and then America is going to have to increase her troops, like she did in South Vietnam. You know, she has. She's not at war over there. You know, they're only over there advising. They got about 20,000 advisors, you know, on the front line. But it's not a war. It's just they're in an advisory capacity while they insult the intelligence of their own public. And they're going to have to end up doing the same thing in the Congo. They'll be trapped. They'll have to eventually send American troops to occupy the Congo because the African freedom fighters are going to fight. They're not going to give up 1 inch without fighting back. And this is something that you should know, that they realize now on the African continent what's at stake and how much all of these Western powers have in common in what they're doing in cahoots with each other behind the closed doors. So on the African continent, they are training Africans to be soldiers so that they can invade one of these countries and take it over and give it to their rightful people. One of the reasons, one of the last things I must say concerning the Congo, not only do they not intend for the Congo to fall into African hands because of its mineral wealth, and it has the greatest deposits of some of the richest elements or minerals of any other area on this earth. They don't intend to give it up because of its wealth. Another reason they don't intend to give it up, if you look at the map, you'll see that it is so strategically located geographically, wherein if a real, genuine African government were to come in power over the Congo, then it would be possible for African troops from all countries to invade Angola, which is a Portuguese possession. And if Angola fell, and it would fall, then it would only be a matter of time before Southwest Africa, Southern Rhodesia, and Bechuanaland also would fall, and it would put African troops right on the border of South Africa. And that's where they really want to get, at that man down there in South Africa. And the United States interests are involved in blocking this, yes. Some of these liberals who grin in your face like they're your best friend, they got money tied up in the Congo. Some of the most powerful political figures in this country, and some of them governors over states, got interest in the Congo and got interest in South Africa and got interest all over the African continent and go there. And as the Africans awaken and realize this, it makes them filled with the incentive to never rest until that exploiter is driven out. Along about 1955, they had the Bandung Conference in Indonesia. And at that time, the Africans, the Asians, the Arabs, all of the non-white people got together and agreed to de-emphasize their differences and emphasize what they had in common and form a working unity. And it was the working unity, the spirit of Bandung, created a working unity that made it possible for the Asians who were oppressed, the Africans who were oppressed, and others who were oppressed to work together toward getting independence for these other people. And it was the spirit of Bandung that brought into existence this working unity that made it possible for nations that didn't have a chance to become independent, they did come into their independence. And most of this began along in 1959. And at 59, the spirit of African nationalism was fanned to a high flame, and we then began to witness the complete collapse of colonialism. France began to get out of French West Africa. Belgium began to make moves to get out of the Congo. Britain began to make moves to get out of Kenya, Tanganyika, Uganda, Nigeria, and some of these other places. And although it looked like they were getting out, they pulled a trick that was colossal. In that when you're playing basketball and they get you trapped you don't throw the ball away. You throw it to one of your teammates who's in the clear. And this is what the European powers did. They were trapped on the African continent. They couldn't stay there. They were looked upon as colonial imperialists. So they had to pass the ball to someone whose image was different. And they passed the ball to Uncle Sam. And he picked it up and has been running it for a touchdown ever since. He was in the clear. He was not looked upon as one who had colonized the African continent. But at that time, the Africans couldn't see that though the United States hadn't colonized the African continent, he had colonized 22 million blacks here on this continent. Because we were just as thoroughly colonized as anybody else. When the ball was passed to the United States, it was passed at a time when John Kennedy came into power. He picked it up and helped to run it. Was one of the shrewdest backfield runners that history has ever recorded. He surrounded himself with intellectuals, highly educated, learned, and well-informed people. And their analysis told him that the government of America was confronted with a new problem. And this new problem stemmed from the fact that Africans were now awakened, they were enlightened, and they were fearless, they would fight. So this meant that the Western powers couldn't stay there by force, and since their own economies, the European economy and the American economy, was based upon their influence, continued influence over the African continent, they had to find some means of staying there. So they used the friendly approach. They switched from the old open colonial imperialistic approach to the benevolent approach. They come up with some benevolent colonialism, philanthropic colonialism, humanitarianism, or dollarism. Immediately everything was Peace Corps, crossroads. We got to help our African brothers. Pick up on that. Can't help us in Mississippi. Can't help us in Alabama or Detroit, out here in Dearborn, where some real Ku Klux Klan live. So, realizing that it was necessary to come up with these new approaches, Kennedy did it. He won. He created an image of himself that was skillfully designed to make the people on the African continent think that he was Jesus, the great white father, come to make things right. And I'm telling you, some of these Negroes cried harder when he died than they cried for Jesus when he was crucified. From 1954 to 1964 was the era in which we witnessed the emerging of Africa, and the impact that this had upon the civil rights struggle in America has never been told.
Everybody that, helped me to see that, as long as you got your faith, you can ride anything. There's nothing too scary where I'ma just give up. You know what I mean? I've seen hell and everything after it. I've said so many comments on this, but basically it's a hypocritical view, because what you're saying is it's okay for us to live in the dirt, in the gutter, in less than human conditions, but it's not okay for us to tell people that we're living in these conditions. Everything was cool, the ghetto was okay, it was habitable until we started talking about exactly what were the repercussions of living this type of lifestyle, what happens when you live in this kind of environment, what type of person it changes you into. Now all of a sudden it's like you can't talk about that, but this is what we live in. We don't have a choice, you know what I mean? It's either we really kill people, do dope, sell dope, and have murders and do all this crazy stuff, or we talk about the fact that we got so close, man. If it wasn't for this rap thing, we would really have to do A, B, and C. You know what I mean? And that's not good. That's not nothing to look up to, but that's the truth. That's how it is, Every human being inside your chest or your stomach or whatever, we all given from God the survival instinct. And everybody has to live. Self-determination. You have to live. You have to be able to live and survive and live like a human being, not like an animal. So whatever it takes to live like that is what happens, whatever it takes. If you put Bob Dole in those conditions, he would do the same thing. So would C. Dolores Tucker. And she wasn't so rich, she didn't have the pearls, and she didn't have the NAACP backing her up and all these conventions and coalitions backing up, and she was by herself and she was on welfare. She would love our music because she would know what this music brings. She would know where we're from, what we're talking about. But from where she at, she can't understand and not understand where they coming from, because now that I got money, it's hard for me to hear a lot of the stuff that we got to listen to. But I can't be a hypocrite, though. I got to understand it's only a few dollars that's keeping me from being that right there.
Like to quote is an African proverb that says that a man that if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. Because the coming of the Europeans, not only to Africa, but the coming of the Europeans to the world was disaster. And yet, when you read the history books, the assumption is that the coming of the Europeans was the bringing of the light. And yet, everywhere he went in the world, he put out the light. He brought no civilization to anybody, anywhere, any place in the world. Now I am reversing history, and if I couldn't prove it, I wouldn't be saying it. First place, you have to deal with something in one of the great myths in human history, and that is the myth of the invader as civilizer and conqueror. No people ever conquered, invaded any people for the sake of civilizing them. This is even true when blacks are invading blacks. This is true across the board. This is true every time in history. Now I can point to what seemed to be an exception, and if you bend history a little bit, you can make it an exception. But you'll be making it an exception, but if you look well, there's not an exception at all. When the Cushites invaded Egypt and created the mighty 25th dynasty, they improved Egypt. They put Egypt's house in order, and they gave Egypt her last walk in the sun. Here was a case where the invader did some good. Does that prove me wrong? No. I still maintain that the invader always does more harm than good. Then what am I talking about in this case? The invasion was not really an invasion in the true sense. The Cushites from the south were relatives of the Egyptians. They were African relatives invading the house of the relative and telling the relative, put your house in order before the foreigners come back here and take over both of us. So it was not an invasion in the true sense, because those in the south was just as much of the north as the others. And when they invaded, the question of the three great generals that invaded Castor, Pianki, Tamaka was, are you obeying the old religion? Are you true to the great religions of the river? And they asked them, are you obeying the laws and the moral laws laid down by the last great goddess of the Nile Valley, the woman goddess Maya? Are you true to her teachings? And when you look today and see all the people hung up called women's lib, these black men, 751 BC, asking other black people, are you obeying the moral laws laid down by a woman? This will blow the white people's mind. today, talking about women's white equality, when these people wanted to know whether you obeying a black woman who was a god. And they worried about whether they should elect a white woman as the executive. They're talking about equality. And they were talking about gods. These people so far behind us, even a pity. Now, when you analyze what I'm talking about, I've showed you an exception. But when you analyze it, it wasn't an invasion at all. Just one relative trying to put another relative's house in order. Because it wasn't an invasion at all, because the South and the North was one and the same. I can show you another example outside of Egypt. The African invasion of Spain. The Africans, Berbers, and Arabs gave Spain the greatest material civilization it ever had before or since. Yet, the Africans, Berbers, and Arabs so depressed Iberian or Spanish culture to the point it hasn't recovered to this very day. If you go to Spain right now, when they point to some achievement, it is some achievement the Moors left behind. They still hadn't recovered. I say every invader depresses the culture of a people and takes more away ultimately than they gave. I'm talking about the Europeans coming to the world, doing the whole world more harm than good. And if he say he is the bringer of the light, he is a liar and a hypocrite, because he brought no light, he put out the light. And that he is in a position right now of losing the world, and each time he called an age his golden age is that age when he has somebody else to exploit outside of Europe, and that he never had a golden age when he had only Europe to feed on. He is being pushed right now to a point where he is being deprived of the land and the resources outside of Europe, when he would rather blow up the world if he can't rule it. And so the people of the world had better protect themselves or prepare to go back and change, because he'd rather enslave it or destroy it if he can't rule it.
Before the Black Muslim movement came along, the NAACP was looked upon as radical. They were getting ready to investigate it. And then along came the Muslim movement, and it frightened the white man so much, he began to say, thank God for old Uncle Roy. And got a whole lot of uncles in there. I can't remember their names. One of the things that made the Black Muslim movement grow was its emphasis upon things African. This was the secret to the growth of the Black Muslim movement. African blood, African origin, African culture, African ties. And you'd be surprised. We discovered that deep within the subconscious of the black man in this country, he's still more African than he is American. He thinks that he's more American than African because the man is jiving him, and then the man is brainwashing him every day, telling him, you're an American, you're an American. Man, how could you think you're an American and you have never had any kind of American treat over here? You have never. 10 men can be sitting at a table, eating, dining. And I can come and sit down where they're dining. They're dining. I got a plate in front of me, but nothing is on it. Because all of us are sitting at the same table, are all of us diners? I'm not a diner until you let me dine. Then I become a diner. just being at the table with others who are dining doesn't make me a diner. And this is what you got to get in your head here in this country. Just because you're in this country doesn't make you an American. And no, you got to go farther than that before you can become an American. You got to enjoy the fruits of Americanism. And you haven't enjoyed those fruits. You've enjoyed the thorns. You've enjoyed the thistles. But you have not enjoyed the fruits. No, sir. You have fought harder for the fruits than the white man has. You have worked harder for the fruits than the white man has. But you've enjoyed less. When the man put the uniform on you and sent you abroad, you fought harder than they did. Yeah, I know you. When you're fighting for them, you can fight. The black Muslim movement did make that contribution. They made the whole civil rights movement become more militant and more acceptable to the white power structure. He would rather have them than us. In fact, I think we forced many of the civil rights leaders to be even more militant than they intended. I know some of them who get out there and boom, boom, boom and don't mean it, because they run back in their corner as soon as the action comes. John F. Kennedy also saw that it was necessary for a new approach among the American Negroes. And during his entire term in office, he specialized in how to psycho the American Negro. Now, a lot of y'all don't like my saying this, but I wouldn't ever take a stand on that if I didn't know what I was talking about. And I don't, by living in this kind of society, pretty much around them, and you know what I mean when I say them, I learned to study them. And you can think that they mean you some good oftentimes, and if you look at it a little closer, you'll see that they don't mean you any good. That doesn't mean there aren't some of them who mean good. But it does mean that most of them don't mean good. Kennedy's new approach was pretending to go along with us in our struggle for civil rights and different other forms of rights. But I remember the expose that Look magazine did on Meredith's situation in Mississippi. And Look magazine did an expose showing that Robert Kennedy and Governor Barnett had made a deal wherein the Attorney General was going to come down and try and force Meredith into school, and Barnett was going to stand at the door, and say, no, you can't come in, and he was going to get in anyway. But it was all arranged in advance, and then Barnett was supposed to keep the support of the white racists because that's who he's holding up, and Kennedy would keep the support of the Negroes because that's who he'd be holding up. And I say and it was a cut and dry deal. And it's not a secret, it was written. They write about it. But now if that's a deal and that's a deal, how many other deals do you think go down? What you think is on the level is crookeder, brothers and sisters, than oppressor, which is most crooked. Approach that was used by the administration right on up until today, even the present generation, was designed skillfully to make it appear that they were trying to solve the problem when they actually weren't. They would deal with the condition, but never the cause. They only gave us tokenism. Tokenism benefits only a few. It never benefits the masses. And the masses are the ones who have the problem, not the few. That one who benefits from tokenism, he doesn't want to be around us anyway. That's why he picks up on the token. The masses of our people still have bad housing, bad schooling, and inferior jobs that don't compensate with sufficient salary for them to carry on their life in this world. So that the problem for the masses has gone absolutely unsolved. And the only one for whom it has been solved are people like Whitney Young, who's supposed to be placed in the cabinet, so the rumors say. He'll be one of the first black cabinet men, and that answers where he's at. And others who have been given jobs, Carl Rowan, who was put over the USIS, who is very skillfully trying to make Africans think that the problem of the black man in this country is all solved. And this is the worst thing the white man can do to himself, is to take one of these kind of Negroes and ask him, how do your people feel, boy? And he's going to tell that man that we are satisfied. And that's what they do, brothers and sisters. So they get behind the door and tell the white man we're satisfied. Just keep me up here in front of him, boss, and I'll keep him Now keep them behind you. That's what they talk when they ain't behind closed doors. Because see, the white man doesn't go along with anybody who's not for him. He doesn't care whether you're for right or wrong. He wants to know, are you for him? And if you're for him, he doesn't care what else you're for, as long as you're for him. Then he puts you up over the Negro community. You become the spokesman. And in your struggle, it's like standing on a revolving wheel. You're running, but you're not going anywhere. You run faster and faster, and the wheel just goes faster and faster. You never leave the spot that you're standing in. So it is very important to see that the only way that our problem is going to be solved, it has to be with a solution that will benefit the masses, not these upper class, so-called upper class. Actually, there's no such thing as an upper class Negro, because he gets the same hell as the other class Negro. All of them get the same hell, which is one of the things that's good about this racist system. It makes us all one. Quickly, if you'll notice, in 1963, everyone was talking about the centennial of progress. I think that's what they called it. 100 years since the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and they were going to celebrate how much white and black people have learned to love each other in America. You probably remember how they were talking in January of 1963. Well, if you had stood up in January at the same time that they were talking all this talk about a good year ahead, good things ahead, and told them that by May, Birmingham would have exploded and Bull Connor would be known as an international thug for the brutality that he heaped upon black people. If you would tell the people in January of '63 that John F. Kennedy would be killed for his role and everything, if you had told them in January that Medgar Evers would be murdered and nobody able to bring his killer to justice, or if you were to have told them in January of 1963 that a church would be bombed in Birmingham with 4 little black girls blown to bits while they were praying and serving Jesus, why, they would say you're crazy. In 1964, they started out the same way. That was the year of promise. If you were to have told them while they were talking about this great year of promise ahead, civil rights and all of that, what was coming, that before long 3 civil rights workers would be brutally murdered and the government unable to do anything about it, a Negro educator in Georgia brutally murdered in broad daylight, and the men who did it be known and the government not able to do anything about it. If you had said this in January of '64, they'd say you were not. Now they're starting out in 1965 the same way, talking about the Great Society, anti-poverty. If you tell them right now what is in store for 1965, they'll think you crazy for sure. But 1965 will be the longest and hottest and bloodiest year of them all. And it has to be. Not because you want it to be, or I want it to be, or we want it to be, but because the conditions that created these explosions in 1963 are still here. The conditions that created explosions in '64 are still here. You can't say that you're not going to have an explosion and you leave the condition. The ingredients are still here. And as long as those ingredients, explosive ingredients, remain, then you're going to have the potential for explosion on your hands. And brothers and sisters, let me say, I spend my time out there in the street with people, all kind of people, listening to what they have to say, and they're dissatisfied. They're disillusioned. They're fed up. They're getting to the point of frustration where they are beginning to feel, what do they have to lose? And when you get to that point, you're the type of person who can create a very dangerously explosive atmosphere. This is what's happening in our neighborhoods to our people. I read in a poll taken by Newsweek magazine this week saying that Negroes are satisfied. Oh yes, poll, in Newsweek, supposed to be a top magazine with a top poster, talking about how satisfied Negroes are. Maybe I haven't met the Negroes he met, because I know he hasn't met the ones that I've met. But this is dangerous. This is where the white man does himself the most harm. He invents statistics to create an image, thinking that that image is going to hold things in check. You know why they always say Negroes are lazy? because they want Negroes to be lazy. They always say Negroes can't unite because they don't want Negroes to unite. And once they put this thing in the mind, they feel that the Negro gets that into him, and he tries to fulfill that image. If you say you can't unite him, and then you come to him to unite him, he won't unite because it's been said that he's not supposed to unite. It's a cycle that they work, and it's the same way with these statistics. When they think that an explosive era is coming up, then they grab their press again and begin to shower the Negro public to make it appear that all Negroes are satisfied. And because if you know that you're dissatisfied all by yourself and 10 others aren't, you play it cool. But you know if all 10 of you are satisfied, you get with it. Well, this is what the man knows. The man knows that if these Negroes find out how dissatisfied they really are, and all of them, even Uncle Tom is dissatisfied, he's just playing his part for now. And this is what makes them frightened. It frightens them in France, it frightens them in England, and it frightens them in the United States. And it is for this reason that it is so important for you and me to start organizing among ourselves intelligently and try to find out what are we going to do if this happens, that happens, or the next thing happens. Don't think that you're just going to run to the man and say, look, boss, this is me. Why, when the deal goes down, you look just like me in his eyesight. Yeah, I'll make it tough for you. Yes, when the deal goes down, he doesn't look at you in any better light than he looks at me. I was on a television program in New York last week. One of the liberals did a takeoff on James Farmer. Now here's James Farmer teaching Negroes to be nonviolent and loving and all of that. Why, they should be patting him on the back. And instead of them patting him on the back, they want to knock at him, and it put me in a position of having to defend him. And which I did. I was glad to, because I wanted to crack this man's neck anyway, and mentally, so that, rather I should say, intellectually. So I point these things out, brothers and sisters, so that you and I will know the importance in 1965 of being in complete unity with each other, harmony with each other, and not letting the man maneuver us into fighting one another. There is a situation where I have been maneuvered right now between me and the black Muslim movement, something that I really deeply regret, because I don't think anything is more destructive than two groups of black people fighting each other. But something that can't be avoided, because it goes deep down beneath the surface, and these things will come up in the very near future. I might say this before I sit down. If you recall, when I left the black Muslim movement, I stated clearly that it wasn't my intention to even continue to be aware that they existed, but that I was going to spend my time working in the non-Muslim community. But they were fearful that if they didn't do something, that perhaps many of those who were in the mosque would leave it and follow a different direction. So they had to start doing a takeoff on me, plus they had to try and silence me because of what they know that I know. And I should think that they should know me well enough to know that they certainly can't frighten me. But when it does come to the light, excuse me for keep coughing like that, but I got some of that smoke last night. But there are some things involving the black Muslim movement which, when they come to light, you will be shocked. The thing that you have to understand, where those of us in the black Muslim movement were concerned, all of us believed 100% in the divinity of Elijah Muhammad. We believed in him. We actually believed that God had taught him, right here in Detroit, by the way, that God had taught him and all of that. And I always thought that he believed it himself. And I was shocked when I found out that he himself didn't believe it. And when that shock reached me, then I began to look everywhere else and try to get a better understanding of the things that confront all of us, so that we can get together in some kind of way to offset it. I want to thank you for coming out this afternoon, this evening. I think it's wonderful that as many of you came out, considering the blackout on the meeting that took place. Also, and the brothers who are here are very progressive young men, and I would advise all of you to get with them in every way that you can to try and create some kind of united effort toward common goals, common objectives, and don't let the power structure maneuver you into a time-wasting battle with others when you could be involved in something that's constructive and getting a real job done. One thing I should have pointed out to you, that once we formed our new organization, once we became identified with the Orthodox Muslim world, We also formed a group known as the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which is designed to fight all the negative political, economic, and social conditions that exist in our neighborhood. It's a non-religious organization to which anyone can belong who's interested in direct action. And one of our first programs is to take our problem out of the civil rights context and place it at the international level of human rights so that the entire world can have a voice. We keep it civil rights, then the only place we can turn for allies is within the domestic confines of America. But when you make it a human rights struggle, it becomes international. And then you can open the door for all types of advice and support from our brothers in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and elsewhere. So it's very, very important. That's our international aim. And that's our external aim. Our internal aim is to become immediately involved in a mass voters registration drive, but we don't believe in voter registration without voter education. We believe that our people should be educated into the science of politics so that they will know what a vote is for and what a vote is supposed to produce, and also how to utilize this united voting power so that you can control the politics of your own community and the politicians that represent that community.
All right, now let us look at the world of Africa and Asia, but principally Africa, before that European came out of that box the second time. All right. The first time he was pushed back into Europe by a combination of Africans and Arabs after he had played around with Christianity, disgraced it, brought on Islam, was pushed out of the Mediterranean. All right. During these years, he is out of the Mediterranean. He was forced into what he called the middle of the Dark Ages. For 700 years now, he's been in Europe, feeding on Europeans. He has not enslaved the African principally because he has been enslaving Europeans under a form of slavery that he called feudalism. Strong Europeans have taken the land and enslaved other Europeans to work the land. The biggest landowner in Europe is the church. The exploitation of the people under the guise of divine right of the church. And the church has calmed down the people. Talk about the Catholic Church. It's the only church they recognized at that time. That the people are going to get theirs in the hereafter. The people are so burdened with taxation and that the people are about to explode. Now, to get more funds to build the cathedrals and to support the top-heavy ministry, the gold lace robes of the priests and the bishops, they are selling compensations to the people. Then they have to look around for different ways to make money from the people. And so now they have something laying in wait they haven't exploited, something called purgatory. For so much money and so many prayers, we will pray hard from purgatory into heaven. Then they begin to sell compensations and favors, tassels. The more tassels you got, the closer you are to God. And the church figures begin to, selling all kind of forgiveness toys. And in the midst of all of this, the people began to grumble. They've got nothing left. The church is bleeding them dry. The people are about to explode against the church. Then something came, save the church in the nick of time. A beatnik, religious wanderer, Peter the Hermit, Saladin, had barred the Christian pilgrims from going to the Holy Land to see the Holy Grail and the holy places. He spread the news across Europe. How dare this infidel keep us from the holy places to see the ornamentations, the chalice, and all of the things that touched by our Lord, including the very shawl that he died in. He spread the news across Europe. We must go and rescue the Holy Grail. Wasn't lost anyway. So the Pope sees the idea. Now he can take the people's attention off of revolt. He needs an issue to take the people's mind from what the church has been doing to them. Now, you think because of your books that the crusade has something to do with holiness, something to do with religion. Well, I hate to disappoint you, but the crusade was a political thing to save the church from the wrath of the people. Rescue the Holy Grail, rescue the ornamentations from the infidels. People forgot their grievances. And as they began to march across Europe, they could go to a farm and not only take the farmer's products, take the farmer's daughter in the name of God. One was a woman over 10, safe, an unviolated woman in route. They just marched across, just taking everything in sight. They saw the lords being defeated, begging the infidel Turks and the infidel Arabs for mercy. They understood that these were human beings and not gods. They would now demand some basic human rights and some basic decency for themselves, and would not be kicked around like dogs because they were treated worse than dogs when they left. These were white slaves to whites. What I'm trying to show you is that the 300-year making of the mentality of the European that ultimately gonna go into the enslavement of the blacks. What the blacks failed to understand is that the European mentality that enslaved us, that is still intact, was a long time in the making. But once it was crystallized, it was there to stay. And I call this the evil genius of Europe. And you've got to understand that mentality. They are human beings shaped by a condition of history. And you are human beings shaped by a condition of history. And you are shaped by an environmental condition and by a cultural condition. And if you understand something which I've gone over repeatedly, but I still think you missed the point, that all of us are shaped by 3 meetings of history. The people of the sand, the people of the sun, and the people of the ice. The Europeans are still the people of the ice to this day. The Africans are still the people of the sun to this day. The Arabs are still the people of the sand to this day. And each one of us act according to the environment that produced us. And you still act with the sentiment and the beautiful humanity that came out of that sun. And maybe we have spent too much time expecting the sun in the sand, in the ice.
to get together. We should let each one fall in its respective place and stay there. A group of children in Europe decided that if the adults have failed, we will go and rescue the Holy Grail. We will go across Europe and do what they failed to do. And this is the last and the most tragic of all of the Crusades. 250,000 children, maybe a little more, marched across Europe. These kids were sincere, dedicated Christian children, marched across Europe saying that they would go and rescue the Christian ornamentations in the holy places. Adults integrated themselves with the kids, ostensibly to help them, but half of them froze to death, died of hunger. And when they got to the warm waters of the Mediterranean in the spring, they discovered that the adults came in to help them were really slave traders who sold the rest to the infidel Arabs that they were supposed to be fighting. One of the tragic events in human history. Now, if the African understood that event, if the Africans had insight and understood what the Europeans were doing to the Europeans, he could have saved himself from the slave trade. If these people would do that to their children, there's nothing for me to expect. And when the European hit his shore, he'd have killed him on sight. I'll treat him like he's a human being, because I'm a human being. Treat him like a gas. He end up being a slave. That same kind of sentiment is still among African people to this very day. The Aztecs in Mexico did the same thing with Cortez, and he took over Mexico. Less than 2,000 men took over all Mexico, came as the guest, stayed as the conqueror.
Resistance took many shapes. In French West Africa, a focal point was found in Muslim loyalties. Many heroes, still unforgotten, came on that scene. Some, like the Senegalese religious leader Ahmadou Bamba, offered the way of peace, but were still sent into exile. Others, like the fierce warrior leader Samori, fought off French attack after attack, and was crushed and exiled only after years of war. Death took many, strong or weak. With the skulls of earlier wars displayed in their capital, Kumasi, the powerful Ashanti nation ruled over most of modern Ghana. Led by their kings, who had the title of Asantehene, they'd long defended their country against Britain, but now they desperately wanted a peaceful settlement. In 1895, fearing a disastrous war with Britain, King Prempeh made a strong bid for peace from his palace here at Kumasi. He offered the British the right to establish in Ashanti a chartered company with all the concessions, the privilege that such a company could possibly desire. But it wasn't enough, for the British now wanted territorial possession as well as privilege. The Ashanti nation had already fought long, hard battles against the British. But this time, in 1896, they decided to surrender. In a ceremony of deliberate humiliation, the king was made to kiss the British commander's boot and then sent into exile. But it wasn't the end of the story. The British now blundered. A new British governor, Sir Frederick Hodgson, decided that he had to get possession of the sacred golden stool, symbol of the Ashanti nation's soul. Arriving at the British fort here in Kumasi, he ordered the assembled chiefs to hand the stool over. Worse still, he demanded the right to sit on it, something that no person had ever been allowed to do, not even the king himself. To Hodgson's final insult, the Ashanti replied with war. This little fort at Kumasi is what the British had built, just in case, and now they sorely needed it. The few dozen British inmates of the fort were besieged for months and had to eat rats to stay alive. Hodgson's act of folly had exacted a bitter price. Efforts to send in relief from the coast were repeatedly frustrated by Ashanti resistance, until finally the governor and his wife got away to the coast and the absurd but tragic affair could be closed. This ended war between Britain and Ashanti, and a year later, in 1901, the British quietly annexed the country, which became part of the colony of the Gold Coast. All over Africa, the new military technology of automatic guns gave easy victories to the invaders. Countless resistors died. Many thousands at the single battle of Omdurman in Britain's conquest of the Sudan. Meanwhile, in another part of the Sudan, the French were also scoring victories. For the most part, public opinion rejoiced. For were these not victories over an inferior species, a kind of joke humanity? There were some critics, but not many, and their voice was ignored or silenced. What really mattered was to do down one's European rivals. If you were British, to get the better of the French in West Africa or of the Germans in East Africa, while orphans like little Uganda were left on the protective doorstep of Father John Bull.
Who are in Washington, D.C. in positions of power, and from Washington, D.C. they exercise the same forms of brutal oppression against dark-skinned people in South and North Vietnam, or in the Congo, or in Cuba, or in any other place on this earth where they're trying to exploit and oppress. This is a society whose government doesn't hesitate to inflict the most brutal form of punishment and oppression upon dark-skinned people all over the world. To wit, right now, what's going on in and around Saigon and Hanoi, and in the Congo and in elsewhere. They are violent when their interests are at stake. But with all of that violence that they display at the international level, when you and I want just a little bit of freedom, we're supposed to be nonviolent. They're violent. They're violent in Korea, they're violent in Germany, they're violent in the South Pacific, they're violent in Cuba, they're violent wherever they go. But when it comes time for you and me to protect ourselves against lynchers, they tell us to be nonviolent. Who are in Washington, D.C. in positions of power, and from Washington, D.C. they exercise the same forms of brutal oppression against dark-skinned people in South and North Vietnam, or in the Congo, or in Cuba, or in any other place on this earth where they're trying to exploit and oppress. This is a society whose government doesn't hesitate to inflict the most brutal form of punishment and oppression upon dark-skinned people all over the world. To wit, right now, what's going on in and around Saigon and Hanoi, and in the Congo and in elsewhere. They are violent when their interests are at stake. But with all of that violence that they display at the international level, when you and I want just a little bit of freedom, we're supposed to be nonviolent. They're violent. They're violent in Korea, they're violent in Germany, they're violent in the South Pacific, they're violent in Cuba, they're violent wherever they go. But when it comes time for you and me to protect ourselves against lynchers, they tell us to be nonviolent. Against the violence of others, they use their press skillfully to make the world think that I'm calling on violence, period. And I wouldn't call on anybody to be violent without a cause. But I think the black man in this country, above and beyond people all over the world, will be more justified when he stands up and starts to protect himself against the violence of others. They use their press skillfully to make the world think that I'm calling on violence, period. And I wouldn't call on anybody to be violent without a cause. But I think the black man in this country, above and beyond people all over the world, will be more justified when he stands up and starts to protect himself